Okay, what I'd like to talk about is the youth to school transition here in the Philippines. And that's based on a survey that we did in Metro Manila and Cebu. I'd then talk about the situation of youth in the labour market and looking at some indicators such as those not in employment, education or training, and known as the net rate. I'll briefly talk about what other countries are doing to help facilitate a faster school-to-work transition. And then talk about some of the Philippines' initiatives. And here we'll talk about a little bit on the labour market information systems, but on a Job Start Philippines program. So what is the youth school to transition? And particularly what we're interested in from the Asian Development Bank side. The transition describes the activities and time taken by young persons to find a job since leaving school or college. And this transition may include the following activities. First of all, it can be you'll find that a lot of young people, when they leave high school or college, they'll be out actively looking for a job, so they're going to be doing job search. They may also enter into short-term skills training programs, so they might go to TVET or a polytechnic school for several weeks or for a number of months to acquire those skills that may be relevant for the labour market. They might also enter into temporary work during this period. And temporary work is an important channel for young people to find their first job. And they may also be inactive. There may be periods where the young person might be staying at home, out of employment, education, or training. So these are different kind of events that may occur during that school-to-work transition for a lot of young people. Why we're particularly interested in the youth school-to-work transition is that the longer they are out of the labour market, or the longer that this transition takes, the more difficult it may be for young people to integrate into the labour market over the longer term. So how do we measure the school-to-work transition? For our study that we did a few years back here in the Philippines, we looked at three common indicators. The first one is that we want to know the average time it takes for a young person to find a job after leaving school or college. The second indicator is the number or share of young people that find a job X number of years since leaving school or college. So it provides a more time path measurement of that school-to-work transition. For example, 20% young people find a job 12 months after leaving school, or 5 years after leaving school, or 8 years. The third indicator is we'd like to look at the share of youth that are not in employment, education, or training, essentially inactive, out of the labour market. Now, for our study on the school-to-work transition, we looked at primarily two sources of labour market information. The first was from the Philippines Labour Force Survey, which is a household-based survey of around just over 30,000 households, and it's a quarterly survey. So it provides a very rich information on the labour market, but it doesn't include dynamic information that allows us to measure more dynamic labour market indicators. So we've also developed a survey of 500 households with over 1,500 working age individuals in Metro Manila and Cebu, with the households randomly selected from the National Register of the Philippines Family Income and Expenditure Survey. So the selection was a representative of those two large urban areas. Based on that survey, we had a questionnaire for each household member, and we're able to get them to talk about their education, their first job, second job, etc. So we were able to do a kind of a backcast of their labour market experience. So I'm going to briefly go over some of those findings. And our first question was, how long does it take, on average, for a young Filipino to find their job since leaving school? And what we've sort of, in conclusion, the results indicate that the transition from school to work is very slow, particularly for high school graduates. It takes, on average, college graduates up to 2 years to find a regular wage job. But it takes high school graduates up to 4 years to find a regular wage job. That's partly, there's an age effect. In the Philippines, a lot of high school graduates might leave school around the age of 16. The working age is 18, so there's going to be 2 years that they're idle. Now, how many youth are employed since leaving school in the Philippines? So this is a more time-based measurement of that transition to school. Now, for high school graduates, based on that survey, we found that 20% of them find a job 1 year leaving school. However, over time, more of them get employed, and 70% of those high school graduates are usually in employment 8 years after leaving school. So it's a very slow transition from school to work, particularly for high school graduates. If we look at college graduates, almost 3/4 of them will find a job within 1 year of leaving school. So you can see a huge difference between those that have high school education and those that have college education in the Philippines, where the transition from school to work is relatively easier for high school graduates, for college graduates compared to high school graduates. How does the Philippines compare with other countries? And here we're using an OECD Employment Outlook report a few years back. That was prior to the global financial crisis, so the numbers may be different now. The countries, the European countries that we have listed up, their data comes from Eurostat, which is a much more comprehensive database. So the Philippines measurements are not strictly comparable because it's a smaller sample size. But what you see here is, I'll put Philippines at the bottom. So ER stands for employment rate, 1 year after leaving school. As I mentioned, for all youth, it's around 60%. 20% for high school graduates, 75% for college graduates. But as an aggregate, 60% of youth would find a job 1 year after leaving school, about 70% 5 years after leaving school. You'll see that countries like Germany, Switzerland, the UK, Netherlands have very high rates, employment rates for youth. 1 year after leaving school, 5 years after leaving school. But if you look at countries such as Italy, Spain and Greece, those rates are much lower, and actually similar to the Philippines. The last column, which gives the median time it takes to find the first job, again, and that's in years. Again, Germany, Switzerland, United Kingdom, Netherlands have the median time is relatively low. So they have a fast transition from school to work, whereas countries like Italy, Spain, Greece, and again, Philippines, it takes longer to find a job. So the transition from school to work is much more slower, much more uncertain, and I think stressful for young people. Before I go on to the next measurement, which is the net rate, I want to say that I think most of the literature would say that those countries that have a faster school-to-work transition is primarily due to two major factors. One is a tight arrangements between the education, training sector and the labour market, so that the training sector are producing graduates that are in demand. And also labour markets that are operating or functioning efficiently. I'll now turn to the third and final indicator, is the share of youth not in employment, education or training. And why we're interested in this particular indicator is that we often just look at unemployment data, and that is those that are actively looking for work. So they are classified as being part of the labour market. That often, particularly for young people, excludes those that have given up looking for work altogether. And they've decided not to be in training or education. And that's the group that we're more concerned about, because the longer they are in that situation, much more difficult it is for them to integrate into the labour market over the longer term. We certainly know that the longer they are in this net status, or the more frequently they fall into it, the more likely they'll have difficulties integrating into the labour market. Now, based on our survey, we could statistically identify those that were most at risk of becoming into that status of not being in employment, education or training for prolonged periods of time. First one is gender. Young women are at higher risk. Education, those with high school education or lower are at much higher risk compared to those in college. And also household income status is important. Though youth from lower household incomes are at higher risk of falling into net status. I want to now give you some pictures. The picture that I'm going to show you is the net rate across gender and age group. So the vertical axis is the share of population in net by age. So if you look at 15-year-olds, it's around 10% would be not in employment, education or training. And this one is females, the red line, and the bottom line, the blue one, is males. So you can see that for a young woman between the ages of 19 right up to around 30, almost half of them would be not in employment, education or training. But that's a huge number. It starts to decline as women enter into the labour market in their 30s and 40s. Now, education is really important. Again, the vertical axis is the share of population in net, and we have three different education categories. Again, that's age. We have those who did not graduate from high school, those who graduated from high school, and those that graduated from college. And you can see that those that have, the net rates are very high for those that have high school education or dropped out of school. So if you look at the blue figure, that's those that dropped out of high school, the net rate is around 60% for young women in their early 20s. So essentially they're not in employment, education or training, just staying at home. For college graduates, which is the bottom line, you can see that those net rates are very low. So for young women that have a college or TVET qualification, they're more likely to enter into the labour market much earlier and stay there much longer, and perhaps delay forming families, and those net rates are much lower. And then you can look at the mean. Education really doesn't matter in terms of them being in the labour market. Quickly, I'll just go over household income, because I think this is also an important risk factor. The bottom axis is, the vertical one again is the share of youth population. The bottom one is income classification. So low stands for the poorest 20% households. High refers to the 20 richest households in the Philippines nationally. And this is for a young woman. And again, you can see that high net rate for young women from low income families. So around 45% of young women in the lowest income category will be in net, whereas for young women in the highest or the richest households, the net rates are less than 20%. And this arises for a number of factors. Young women from high income families go to better schools, get better educated, and families have quality social networks. Young men, it varies. It's kind of flat across income groups because it comprises of those that are unemployed and those that are outside the labour market. But if we look at just the main urban areas, this is the National Capital Region. Again, for women, it's similar to the national figures. For young men in NCR, you can see it varies from the national figures. Here in the major urban area, you still have a lot of young men from low-income households that are in net. And how does the Philippines compare with other countries? This data is from a number of different sources. We try to ensure that they were comparable. They're not strictly comparable, but the Philippines is around in the mid-range of countries. It's a bit lower than India and Indonesia, but a little bit higher than some of the Latin American countries. And of course, the EU 27 OECD. This is 2013 data, so it is post-global financial crisis. I want to briefly talk about how do countries, other countries that we look at, try to facilitate a much faster school-to-work transition. Of course, keeping young people in school longer is an important factor. And there are a number of ways to do it. Here in the Philippines, they have a new reform program that's extended 2 years on high school education. So instead of leaving school at 16, most of them now should leave at 18. Countries will try to strengthen those links between the education and training system. You can do it through a good apprenticeship program, 2 to 3 years programs. Here in the Philippines, it's very difficult to have an apprenticeship program beyond 6 months. There are also other financing incentives that can help encourage more skills training. Employee tax rebates, like in Chile, or you could use national or sector-based skills funding grants to industry that helps to train young people. So these are a number of ways to help facilitate a school-to-work transition to make it a bit faster. Other ones, of course, is what's familiar with everybody here, is the different employment facilitation programs that are to support at-risk youth, particularly targeting youth that got left behind in the education system that may require remedial programs. And a lot of these programs are channeled through employment service offices. Now, I want to just briefly, in closing, just a couple more slides, interventions here in the Philippines that are helping to facilitate that school-to-work transition. And the first one importantly, is the labour market information systems. Both the Asian Development Bank and funded by the Canadian government have been working closely with the Department of Labour, and an action plan for enhancing labour market information systems has been endorsed. And it builds on some of Dolly's existing systems, such as the Skills Registry and Field Jobs Net, which was talked about earlier this morning by the Secretary. In the action plan, functions are defined at the local government level to collect information on vacancies in labour markets, so to allow better job forecasts and skills profiling. And at the functions at the national level is to aggregate this for aggregate labour demand forecasts and analysis. Of course, for youth to access labour market information through the various e-channels, such as the Skills Registry system. These are also important because they are to be linked to the various programs, employment programs that the Department of Labour has, and I'll turn to to one of them, and that's the JobStart Philippines program. It's just completing its pilot. It's a youth employment program of the Department of Labour. It's ADB and the Canadian government have been supporting the pilot. And the JobStart Philippines program really aims to improve the employability profile of youth. And it's for those who have graduated from high school or college, but they require remedial assistance to integrate into the labour market. And so the targeted beneficiaries of the pilot have been 18 to 24-year-olds, youth who are not in employment, education or training at the time of registering for JobStart, and have 12 months or less work experience. During the pilot, we found that many of the beneficiaries were from the lower income families, so it was a well-targeted pilot project. Now, the kind of services, how does that help facilitate school-to-work transition for at-risk youth? It's intended to be a full cycle of services. It's operated through the public employment offices. And the principle is to empower the youth to think about their career choices through career coaching. And JobStart invests in a number of skills that improves their employability profile. For example, there's an 8-day life skills training program, which is an intensive course for the young people. It's about resume writing. It's about how do you perform in your interviews. It's about communication skills, teamwork. How do you expect it to perform and behave in the workplace? There's financial literacy and health. So it's a whole package of life skills to help them to be ready for the labour market. JobStart also gives them the opportunity for short-term technical training up to 3 months, and on-the-job training with employers to get that work experience, again, up to 3 months. What's a very good principle of the program is that it involves employers early in the decision-making process. It's the employer that develops that technical and on-the-job training plan, and they sign an agreement with the young person for that 6-month program. Scaling up JobStart Philippines, the pilot was in 4 local government units, 2 in the NCR, 1 in Cavite City and the other one in Pampanga. Dolly has endorsed a nationwide rollout of the first stage of JobStart from 2015 to 2020, targeting 64 local government units. And it's partnering with the Asian Development Bank and the Government of Canada during that rollout stage. Just to also mention that the pilot has a randomized impact evaluation framework. So those that went into the pilot, we had over 5,000 young people registered, but we took in only half of those young people, and we selected them by a public lottery. So that ensured that it was randomized. So over the next 6 months, we are able to trace the performance of those that went through JobStart and compare them with those that applied for the program but didn't get selected, the control group. And that'll help us to statistically ascertain, did those that go through JobStart perform better than those that didn't? This is just briefly, we did a midterm evaluation, and certainly from the employers, they appreciated the life skills training. It also is a program that can help them address their skills shortages, and for the beneficiaries, some of the benefits for them that were reported were the life skills training to help improve confidence, but also getting that work experience, help them to build up their resume. Thank you very much.